Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is the costs and benefits of offshore wind transmission options. This webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance as part of the Offshore Wind Accelerator Project, and we have a number of excellent guest speakers with us on the line today. Before I pass it over to them, I'd like to go over a few quick webinar logistics. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of today's webinar. You can call in via telephone, or you can use a computer mic and speakers. If you'd like to minimize your webinar console so that you can view the presentation full screen, you can click on the orange arrow that you see circled here. And you can also click on that arrow to expand the webinar console if you'd like to. And one of the things that you might want to use on your webinar console is the questions box, which you also see circled here. We will be having a Q&A following our presentation, and we would like to get to as many questions and comments as we can during that time. So please do submit your questions and comments as you think of them. And a final note, we are recording this webinar. We'll send you an email with a copy of the webinar recording within about 24 to 48 hours, probably this afternoon. And we'll also be posting all of those webinar materials on CESA's website at cesa.org/webinars. So with that, I'd like to now pass it over to our host for today's webinar, Val Story. Val is a project director here at the Clean Energy States Alliance, and she is going to get us started. Val, over to you.
Thanks, Sam. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. Looking forward to today's webinar and following discussion. So yes, as Sam mentioned, this is a webinar of the Clean Energy States Alliance, specifically our OAP project, the Offshore Wind Accelerator project, in which, as you might imagine, we work with our state energy agency members and related agencies to accelerate offshore wind development. And we do so by providing policy and programmatic expertise, and we also facilitate the exchange of information both among our members and between our members and European expertise and other experts. You can see a snapshot of CESA's membership up on the slide that Sam has up now. Next slide. So today we have 3 guest speakers, and I will introduce them in a moment, but I wanted to take a moment to set the stage for today's presentations and discussion. We're going to be talking about offshore wind transmission, and as I'm sure all of you are aware, offshore wind is playing an increasingly large and important role in helping the region meet its decarbonization goals. Nearly 19 gigawatts of offshore wind are planned in the Northeast by 2035. And with this vast amount of planned offshore wind capacity, long-term onshore and offshore grid planning is needed to facilitate the development of efficient, timely, and cost-effective transmission infrastructure. States are grappling with how offshore wind transmission and interconnection should be planned, and they're trying to answer what types of offshore configurations can best accommodate offshore wind's rapid growth. We have seen that some state offshore wind solicitations have allowed developers to propose generator lead lines, or they've been asked to explain how they will tie into an independent transmission network should one exist. For example, in New Jersey's most recent solicitation, they asked applicants to address how the proposed project could work with any future offshore wind transmission grid, and to discuss how or if the proposed project could make its interconnection facility available to future projects. So there's lots of thinking going on into how the rapid build-out of offshore wind will interconnect with the land-based grid. And relatedly, Mass DOER, Department of Energy Resources, released recently its findings on offshore wind transmission, finding that at this time, Massachusetts' offshore wind goal was not quite large enough to support the development of a planned independent transmission system on its own, because the cost of such a solicitation would outweigh the benefits. But the findings went on to say and recognize that independent transmission could perform better and more cost effectively at a larger and regional scale. So over the course of the next hour, the Brattle Group is going to speak first, and they're going to be discussing 2 separate studies, one from New England and one for New York. And they're going to be talking about the 2 approaches to offshore wind transmission, both the generator lead line and the planned approach. They will discuss issues unique to each region and the important differences between the regions as well. And they'll present their analysis and findings, which include that a planned independent transmission system can lower overall costs. After our Brattle Group speakers, Peter Shattuck from Anbaric will provide a developer's perspective on independent transmission. And please feel free to use the question dialog box throughout the next hour to type in your questions. After the panelists, I'll be moderating that Q&A session. So moving on to our guest panelists, let me make some introductions. First, to the Brattle Group, we have Hannes Pfeifenberger and Walter Graf. Hannes is a principal at the Brattle Group. He's an economist with a background in electrical engineering and has over 25 years of experience in wholesale power market design, renewable energy, electricity storage, and transmission. He holds an MA in Economics and Finance from Brandeis University's International Business School and an MS and a BS from the University of Technology in Vienna, Austria. And then Walter Graf. Dr. Graf is a Brattle Senior Associate with expertise in electricity wholesale market design and analysis, load forecasting, and rate design. His work focuses on addressing economic issues facing regulators, market operators, and market participants in the electricity industry in the transition to a lower carbon supply mix. He holds a PhD and an MS in agricultural and resource economics from the University of California, Berkeley. I will introduce Peter after the Brattle Group speaks and before Peter speaks. So, Walter and Hannes, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Val, and thank you for organizing this webinar. Thank you for inviting us. As we discussed, we're summarizing the studies we've recently undertaken on behalf of Anbaric for how to address transmission for offshore wind in New England and New York. As you know, the entire East Coast is very active in offshore wind right now, and it has happened only in the last couple of years. We now have offshore wind goals of about 30,000 megawatts along the Atlantic coast, of which half of that, about 15,000 megawatt, is firmly committed to in New York and New England. You see in this table, New England and New York have already contracted about 5,000 megawatts of wind, and the total commitments are 9,000 megawatts in New York, about 6,000 megawatts in New England. But that's only the tip of the iceberg, because as the economies want to decarbonize and reach their 2050 or 2040 decarbonization levels economy-wide, there are a number of studies that have estimated that New England might need anywhere between 25 and 40,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2050, in addition to the onshore solar and onshore wind and other resources. While New York might need between 15 and 25,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2040. So we've only looked at how to integrate the offshore wind that's already committed. In New England, if you add those two up, will go well beyond what the onshore grid can easily handle, and we'll talk more about that. Next slide, please. So the studies, the separate studies that we've done, and we combined the two studies here because the takeaway is actually strikingly similar. But we asked the question, what would the offshore transmission solution likely be like if projects get developed the way they get developed now, that there's a solicitation for generation, and the generation comes with a generator lead line that interconnects at certain onshore points. So you need a gen tie for each project that you bid, and that generator lead line approach is what so far has been the prevailing approach. Only in Europe have we seen solicitations and development move away from the generator lead line approach. The alternative is a planned approach where offshore transmission is planned, so in combination with the required onshore transmission upgrade, you achieve a lower cost solution. And we've projected what such solutions might look like, although the different options and different possibilities, but you'll see from our studies the kind of advantages that you get from applying a more planned approach rather than just a generator lead line approach. Next slide, please. As a summary, to give you some of the highlights, what we find is that a planned approach has lower total transmission costs. You spend a bit more on the offshore transmission, for example, to move to HVDC technology that can transport more power at low losses to landing points that are more suitable to integrate much offshore wind. But by spending more on offshore transmission, you actually substantially lower the onshore upgrade costs with a lower total cost outcome. What's important here is it's not just that it's lower cost, it's also lower risk, because as you all know, upgrading the onshore grid is really difficult. There's lots of local opposition, rights of way is often difficult to come by, permitting process takes a long time. Just imagine upgrading the grid in Long Island. It's just going to be very difficult. So spending more time to develop a better offshore grid actually avoids a lot of the onshore grid upgrades at lower cost and lower risk in both cases. The HVDC technology also reduces the power losses of bringing offshore wind to the load centers. We'll find that the cable mileage that you have in the ocean bed is about half. You have about half the landing points, so have much lower coastal impacts. And what we've seen from the European experience, if you have an offshore grid and you can solicit competitive bids to interconnect offshore, you get better, more competitive bids for the offshore wind, because the offshore wind developers do not need to worry about how to get it to shore, and they can focus on what they do best, which is building the offshore generation and connect those to the offshore grid that is provided for them. The landing points, you can reach better landing points that may be further away but can absorb more power, so you avoid onshore upgrades. And by having an offshore grid, you also allow third-party offshore wind customers to participate, because they might be at smaller scale. It might be in Amazon buying 50 megawatts of offshore wind, but you can't do that on a gen-tie basis. Next slide. So if we go one more, please. If we look to New England, for example, the gen-tie approach would get you an offshore grid that you see on the upper left here. A lot of cables, a lot of small individual cables, looks like a bowl of spaghetti. But what you see with those red lines, these are all the onshore overloads. So all those corridors along those red lines on land would have to be upgraded, and those would be massive upgrades that could result in major project delays. But it's also possible that a gen-tie would trigger an upgrade that is way too costly for a single gen-tie to finance, and it creates a market barrier for that specific offshore grid. Whereas if you're doing a planned grid, you might need to upgrade some of the onshore transmission grid, but you'll do it in a planned way that doesn't necessarily impose the entire cost on a single generator. What you see in the lower left in this chart is a planned grid. You have fewer lines and you have more attractive onshore interconnection points from the perspective of avoiding onshore upgrades. You see there's some lines coming all the way around from the offshore wind areas south of Massachusetts and Rhode Island, all the way into Boston, which is a major load center, which has strong substations, which can absorb more offshore wind than building individual gen-ties onto Cape Cod and try to get from there to the load centers through the onshore grid. The next slide, we see something very similar in New York. New York is very unique, and we'll focus on some of that in greater detail. The wind lease areas are more spread out, and the coastline is much more narrow. As you know, much of the northern coastline that you see there is Connecticut, which is actually in ISO New England, not in the New York ISO. So the objective here would be how much can you actually interconnect in New York. And on the upper left chart, you again see a large number of individual gen ties with a lot more cable mileage in the ocean, with a lot more coastal impacts and much higher costs, as Walter will show you in a little while. The planned approach here, again, can get away with fewer gen ties because you size them not by project, but by technological capability. And you'll be able to reach landing points more cost effective from a total offshore plus onshore grid perspective. You see in those dotted lines here, you also have the option to interconnect these larger tie lines offshore to really create a true offshore grid that ultimately could also connect New England to New York and New York to New Jersey through these individual HVDC lines. Next slide, please. And I'll have Walter get you through the rest of the slides to show you what some of the more detailed results look like. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Hannes. Am I coming through?
Yes.
Yeah, what I'd like to do now is step through some of the results, really highlighting the key results of our two studies. And what we've tried to do here is to synthesize many of the results that really we found that were in common across the two studies. And so I'll focus on those first, and then I'll take a few minutes to look at a few results that are unique or more salient in New York. And then after that, I'll conclude. So I'll start here really with the top line takeaway is that planning is expected to reduce costs and to do so substantially. Perhaps the key driving observation from this study was how large the onshore upgrade costs could be under the current approach. In fact, the estimated cost of onshore upgrades is something like 60% of the offshore transmission costs. In this case, I'm showing the figure for New England, and actually just for the next 3,600 megawatts of offshore wind in New England, which is a small fraction of what we anticipate will be needed over time. There's already a substantial onshore upgrades that are needed if this is pursued through an unplanned approach with generator declines. So this is forward-looking, but it's also consistent with what we're already seeing with already contracted projects in New England and New York. Recent ISO New England studies indicate costs of $500 million or more to conduct upgrades necessary to interconnect into the Cape in New England. And in both New York and New England, we found that the offshore costs could be somewhat higher under a planned approach. There's a need for more expensive offshore collector stations, there's more expensive HVDC lines and so on, but these costs are more than offset by the substantial onshore savings. And I'll focus on those here in this slide, and this figure just zooms into the onshore upgrade cost anticipated under the current approach and the planned approach. So here you see the onshore costs are much lower. In New England, something like $1 billion lower under the planned approach in phase one alone for just the next 3,600 megawatts of offshore wind. In New York, for the next 9,000 megawatts, something like $1.5 billion or more lower onshore. And so that's a lot of money, but also that corresponds not just to dollars, but risk. We think that it's likely that onshore upgrades are substantially more risky mile for mile than offshore costs and offshore upgrades. So there's a relatively large uncertainty range in the estimate of total costs, but we think that the uncertainties of developing the onshore transmission in terms of costs, in terms of development timelines, and so on, given how challenging the permitting process is, how much opposition these projects usually encounter, it could be really substantial. And so it's not just a cost story so far, it's also a risk story that we think planning really substantially reduces the risks facing the risks that we face in meeting the really large targets that we have ahead of us. There's also other benefits to planning. Under a planned offshore grid approach, which you saw uses substantially more HVDC lines, which are higher capacity. This implies a big reduction in the marine trenching that's necessary. So like Hanna said, marine trenching can be reduced by something like 50 to 60% with similar results in both New York and New England. Here I'm just showing the results for New England. This reduces impacts on fisheries, on the marine environment, and it reduces impacts on coastal communities where the transmission has to land. You're reducing the number of cables overall, which reduces the necessary points of interconnection, meaning less disruption on land too. And another point about the planned approach is that if you're planning, offshore cables could be further grouped into transmission corridors to minimize the impacts even more. And this just isn't really possible to enforce under the generator lead line approach. You know, one-off, unplanned generator lead lines, like we showed in those figures that are representative of what we think could happen. There's really a spaghetti bowl of generator lead lines all over the place that certainly are not planned to minimize impacts. There are also substantial benefits to increasing competition among offshore wind generation developers. On the one hand, it certainly simplifies the strategic decisions for developers. Today, developers have to provide binding offers for generation and transmission before they even have an accurate information about what those transmission upgrade costs may be. This risk is costly and eventually gets passed on to consumers. So we think that separating generation and transmission could reduce those risks and reduce costs for consumers in that way. Competition could reduce costs even more. We've seen that in Europe, actually, the recent offshore wind generation developers that have won the solicitations there have won with bids of 0 subsidy needed. So what that means is, given the transmission offshore collector station locations that are already planned, and given that the generation developers don't have to build that transmission, they're actually able to build that offshore wind generation, the turbines and connecting to the offshore collector stations with no additional subsidy and no additional payment beyond what they expect to receive through the energy and capacity markets there. So that's pretty attractive, and that's certainly something that we anticipate could happen here in the US. So that was on the generation side. It would also, a planned approach could also increase competition among offshore transmission developers as well. Studies of both onshore and offshore transmission in the US and in Europe show savings on the order of 20 to 30% with increased competition compared to generator-owned transmission or costs incurred by the incumbent transmission companies. So increasing that competition there could be, again, could have a substantial benefit. So now I'll focus on a couple of slides that unique to, those results were all quite similar across both New York and New England. So there's a few points that I want to make that are more important or more salient in New York. The first of these, is regarding the points of interconnection and the constrained access routes. This is true in New England, but we think that it's even more important in New York. So the story is as follows. in the long term, there's a limited number of landing sites for offshore wind transmission in both New England and New York. And if each offshore wind project requires a separate cable connection to the onshore transmission system, the viable cabling routes become really constrained. So this increases the value of planning because you can identify the capacity of each onshore point of interconnection and then make sure that you build transmission to maximize that capacity. Otherwise, you get a piecemeal approach that doesn't really fully optimize the available capacity of the best points of interconnection. And actually, we're already starting to see some of this with some of the offshore wind coming into New York, where there's serious cable routing issues in some of the Long Island points of interconnection. And probably the clearest example of this is the cable approach route through the Narrows to reach points of interconnection in New York Harbor, which I focus on in the next slide. So the Narrows is this really, narrow waterway leading up to some of the best landing sites in New York. They are really good because they're close both physically and electrically to the huge loads in the New York City area. So Anbaric contracted a study by Intertech to evaluate the cable routing through the Narrows, and Intertech has expertise in subsea power cable routing. And they found that the Narrows area is really quite constrained. The existing federal shipping channel plus anchorages and so on really leave space for only something like 4 offshore wind cables. And 2 of these are already planned by Empire Wind, which is planning to land in at the Gowanus substation. That's their point of interconnection. And they're already using 2 HVAC cables. So a planned approach using 2 DC cables in the remaining slots could take an additional 3,200 megawatts to the really good points of interconnection in there. But if you don't plan, what might happen is using up those remaining spaces with 2 more AC cables that only take 800 megawatts. And so what this means is 2,400 megawatts of incremental offshore wind has to interconnect farther away, somewhere in Long Island, probably, requiring much more substantial onshore upgrades to the existing onshore system in Long Island because it's not much farther from the loads and not nearly as strong in that part of the transmission system. So planning transmission through the Narrows to efficiently utilize this route is really a great example of a critical question that deserves, we think, the focused attention of state planners here. One other difference between the New York and New England studies was what we found in terms of curtailments. In New York, we found that both the planned and the unplanned approach indicate significant amount of offshore wind generation will have to be curtailed. After 9 gigawatts of wind are in service by 2035, modeled curtailment levels are something like 18% under both the generation lead line approach and the planned approach. This is substantially different from what we found in New England, where the planned approach drastically reduced curtailments to near 0. So we think that we don't have the final answer on this, but it just points to needing further analysis to optimize the trade-offs between interconnection costs and curtailments. And we just think it's an issue that requires the planner's attention. Challenges associated with cost allocation under the generator lead line approach, we think will likely hinder development of elective transmission upgrades, because those upgrades are likely to not only benefit a single market participant, but to benefit all of the offshore wind. So designing the offshore grid with a networking capability preserves the option to create meshed offshore configuration to reduce curtailments. We've done some analysis to show how a meshed approach could reduce curtailments in the case of outages in the offshore transmission cables. And that's true both in New York and New England. But there's there's much more work to be done here, and we think that it's an important point of further study for both New York and New England. So I'll conclude with just a few slides here before moving on to Peter. Actually, I can skip that one. Really coming out of this study, we're recommending that the Northeast states implement a planned approach to offshore transmission. And we're envisioning that this could be done through a joint procurement of transmission and generation. Here we lay out one mechanism through which this could be implemented. It's an example, and we think that there are other reasonable alternatives. But before I jump into it, the reason I'm walking through this process in detail is to show that what we're proposing, we think is actually feasible. This is a practical way of leveling the playing field between generators and reducing the risk of stranded assets. So the first step is for the states to identify the preferred onshore points of interconnection and the capacity of each one, like the attractive New York City points of interconnection I mentioned earlier, or Brayton Point, for example, in New England. So after identifying the preferred onshore landing sites, the state could solicit transmission developers to propose multiple fixed price options for offshore collector station locations and points of interconnection. That's on the left there. So in this example, we're showing transmission bidder 1 proposes locations A, B, and C. Bidder 2 proposes options D and E. Then the state evaluates the bids considering the cost, the accessibility to lease areas, impacts on fisheries and environment, and so on, and selects a single winning transmission bidder. Here, that's bidder A. But they don't yet select the final offshore collector station because remember, bidder A offered a menu of potential locations. And then you would solicit the generation developers to bid to interconnect to locations A, B, or C. These were this was the menu of options from transmission developer 1. And you can collect the bids and evaluate considering the total cost of generation plus transmission and other factors to select the generation developer and the finalized offshore collector station location. So here in this example on the right, this is wind farms 4 and 5 connecting to location option C. So maybe this isn't the only way you could do it. Certainly there are other reasonable alternatives, but we think that the point is that there are options, there are alternatives to implement this and lower costs for consumers. Now we do acknowledge that the procurement approach we introduced separates or it could separate the transmission developer from the generation developer. It doesn't necessarily do that. Certainly a generation developer could also bid to develop transmission. But in general, offshore wind developers might dislike this because it increases the risk that transmission won't be available when the offshore wind generation is ready. And this is called project-on-project risk. We think it's helpful to know that the project-on-project risk actually still exists under either approach, planned or unplanned, because the onshore upgrades that are conducted by the incumbent transmission owner, they also have to be ready before the offshore wind goes in service, and the developer doesn't have control over those. And recall, those onshore upgrades are much more necessary and higher cost and higher risk under an unplanned approach. And in addition, we think there are several ways to directly address project-on-project risk through strong performance incentives, through allowing generation developers to do both generation and transmission if they do so at lowest cost. And to some extent, you could probably also set project deadlines so that transmission construction is finished before the offshore wind construction is completed. So we think these risks can be mitigated. And overall, the benefits of planning that we've laid out are quite certain to outweigh these concerns. So really the conclusion of our study is that the overall transmission cost will be lower and can be more closely estimated and phased in and de-risked over time with a well-planned grid. And we think that this approach avoids hitting really a cost wall like you could get with a current approach, where you go to all the nearshore sites, you use them poorly, and then you reach a point where the incremental megawatts of offshore wind are prohibitively expensive. So we've laid out a way that individual states or groups of states can proactively plan for the future and procure the needed transmission and generation. And really, we'd like to see a future where there's broader regional coordination among the states and the ISOs to help meet the policy objectives of the participating states, including planning and procurement of offshore and onshore transmission systems. So with that, I'll close and move on to Peter for the next part of the presentation. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Walter and Hannes. This is Val. We are now going to transition over to Peter, and I'll just make a brief introduction. Just a reminder to our audience to please type in your questions. It's more helpful for me if you could type them in now rather than waiting to the last minute, in which case I might not see them or get to them. So next we're going to hear from Peter Shattuck, who's going to provide a developer's perspective on planned transmission. Peter manages Anbaric's projects across New England. And prior to joining Anbaric, he spent 9 years as Massachusetts Director and Director of the Clean Energy Initiative at the Acadia Center. He holds a Master of Science in Environmental Science from Trinity College in Dublin and a BA from Yale University. Peter, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Val, and thank you for the invitation to join this discussion, and to CSA and also to Brattle for teeing up the issues. Wanted to step back and take that developer's perspective and touch on some of the themes that were highlighted in the Brattle study by talking about what we're seeing actually play out on the ground as the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic offshore wind industry matures. But first, a quick word for those not familiar with Anbaric. We are a project development company focusing on transmission and increasingly storage as well. We have projects up down the coast and inland, and formed through a partnership with the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan. So when we look at some of the themes highlighted in the Brattle study, what I wanted to touch on are really 3 core areas. The first is we're really starting to see these problems with the status quo. The second, more encouraging, is that we're seeing policymakers start to take action to address some of these issues. But the third, and probably most important, is that we need to ramp up those efforts. We need to start really doing the planning and procurement now to avoid some of the major pitfalls that could stall the industry. So starting on the first point, the challenges with the status quo, as Brattle highlighted, interconnection tops the list. And I'll just say that in practice, we're seeing this play out, where the nearshore locations, the easy capacity on the grid is being taken up. And the best example of this right now is in Cape Cod in Massachusetts, where there are 3 contracted projects. The first one that was first in line had $8 million in upgrade costs. The second one had almost $200 million in upgrade costs. And the third, which is yet to have its costs fully fleshed out, but suggestions that it could be on the order of $750, $800 million or more. So we're starting to see that cost wall really hit. And it then highlights the point that Walter made about the project on project risk. And then when you start to get to $800 million plus onshore transmission upgrades, and some of those lines that were on the map showing the need potentially for upgrades, not just on the Cape, but all the way up toward the load center in Boston, that really creates a significant challenge for that project and for the industry, because the experience in New England is that these major onshore projects take a lot of time. The last time major projects were done for reliability, the New England East-West Solutions project took about 7 to 9 years to complete, and they also came in about 80% over budget. So it's a concern for the project. It also really raises the kind of harbinger of projects actually failing. I hate to see this, but this is not abstract. In Maine, there's been experience with this. So onshore wind projects went all the way through the development process, signed contracts with states, and then actually fell apart for lack of transmission to get on the grid. So I think we're getting to the point, clearly getting to the point where the easy interconnections are being taken up. Then the second area is routing, the physical constraints. Walter highlighted these well. I just observed that we are not yet seeing any of these larger capacity cables come in. Of the projects that have been awarded up and down the East Coast, they're all using AC cables in the range of 400 megawatts. And that means that we're potentially underutilizing the shore approaches and connections to the onshore grid, but it also means that there's more structure in the water. And we know that that's been a concern in the fishing industry and could also increase impacts on the environment. And then there's the local community concerns, folks not wanting to see cables under their beaches or coming under their streets. coming up Long Island, some places in the mid-Atlantic, and then some places there are even proposals to bring multiple projects through in succession, and we anticipate that the local concern will only increase. And so taking a step back, there's one important consideration that hasn't gotten a lot of focus, but we know what the lease areas are now, but at some point we're likely to see new lease areas be auctioned, particularly in the New York Bight or the next round. And so for those bidders, when they come in, if we have new entrants, which hopefully we will, buying up those lease areas, and all of these good points of interconnection and cable routes are taken up, that could have a serious stifling effect on competition that flows back to consumers in terms of potentially higher costs. The last issue with the status quo that I want to touch on is curtailment. And this has to do with the fact that most of the projects are seeking energy-only interconnections at this point. And that's fine. And in the near term means that the offshore wind projects are displacing fossil fuels, which I think is one of the objectives of the procurement. But over time, as there are more and more offshore wind projects, there's a risk that these projects essentially displace each other or displace other clean energy resources, hydro, solar, other things. So we've seen this come out of modeling from ISO New England. And I should note, I'm Connecticut based in New England. I've been focusing a lot on the New England area, but I think some of these trends are universal. But again, going back to Cape Cod, as the grid operator has looked to analyze the next round of projects coming in through what they call a cluster study, their assumption is that the new wind will displace the existing wind on the system. And we don't think that's likely the objective of the states. If they're paying for wind generation, they want to see that delivered and delivering that clean energy and reducing emissions. So that's point one, challenges of the status quo. And now that I've gotten everyone down, the encouraging signs are that I think there's some processes and studies that have recently been launched to address some of these issues, which is encouraging. So when we look at planning processes, the New Jersey Energy Master Plan made a clear commitment or recognition that to reach the ultimate goals they have, that planned transmission could provide potential benefits. We've been working with a consultant there to figure out what that actually looks like, and we think that's a great model. In Connecticut, the integrated resource planning process has also made important recognition of transmission constraints and the need to address them. And then just last week, we saw an announcement from the New England States Committee on Electricity that put forward a vision statement that had a significant focus on transmission to enable renewables, not just for offshore wind, but also onshore wind. So we think these are important planning process to get started. And then there's studies underway. New York has some comprehensive transmission study processes. Val mentioned the Massachusetts Technical Conference, where they went through and evaluated this, and as she noted, did determine that 1,600 megawatts is in their determination, too small to take that next step. And then there's this interesting study that I referenced, this cluster study on Cape Cod that the ISO New England grid operator has initiated. An important first step towards recognizing that multiple projects are coming in. May not on its own be sufficient to solve the issues, but it shows that issues are being taken seriously. So the last point is that really we need to ramp these efforts all up. We don't have time to back into major onshore grid upgrades that could take potentially up to 10 years to complete. That would have a real stifling effect, I think, on the industry, on the desire to bring the supply chain over, on investment. The good news is that right now we have a window that the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states have contracted for almost 6.5 gigawatts of offshore wind to come in by the middle of this decade. That's a lot of wind, and that's going to take some time to develop the infrastructure, the port, supply chain, workforce. So we're going to start seeing the benefits of these initial projects in terms of clean energy on the system and economic development, but it provides a window while these projects are taking place to take that step back and make an important focus on offshore transmission. And there we have the strategy and the tools that we need. The strategy is essentially give transmission the independent attention that it needs. We're seeing these problems pop up, so let's continue and build on some of these processes. And then in terms of the tools, the mechanisms are largely in place. This could be done a number of ways. It could be state-led by a single state or multiple states. States have done procurement for bundled projects so far. Essentially, what would be unbundled, and one would be procuring transmission first and then generation, as Walter highlighted. And there are models for this out there. Texas built a grid for wind energy, and I think is an important model because hitting the overall goals does not mean that states have to build a massive grid for offshore wind all at once. What they did in Texas is they determined what their potential was of their wind energy areas in the western part of the state and the panhandle. And then they figured out what sort of incremental transmission that could be expanded upon and could fit into a network, how that should be developed. And they started to build those projects serially so that they could match the pace of development for the resource. And then there's the opportunity to potentially use some of the mechanisms that are in place in the RTOs and ISOs. So Order 1000, which we've seen utilized in New York effectively, upstate. New England just had their first Order 1000 procurement. And then New Jersey is also looking at some, and PJM is also looking at some of these options. So we think the tools are there. So wrapping it back up, essentially the observations are, we're now seeing these problems no longer in the future. They're happening now. We're seeing encouraging first steps towards taking action, and we need to double down on those going forward. Thank you. Back to you, Val.
Great. Thanks, Peter. All right, let's move on to some Q&A. I believe that this one is for the Brattle Group, but Peter, feel free to jump in too. So I believe, Hannes, it was you who mentioned that Europe has had quite a bit of experience with the planned approach, at least I think it was Germany who undertook that approach before the rest of Europe. When did the rest of Europe move away from the generator lead line approach, and why?
Yeah, hi. I think it happened at the point when people realized that their offshore wind procurement ambitions are just too large to make that work with generator lead lines. And after the first few easy interconnection points onshore have been exhausted, not just Germany, but it's also the Netherlands and Belgium. The UK has a very large coastline. They have procured all the offshore wind so far with generator lead lines, but they have now moved to a planned approach because they increased their target. I think they are planning on procuring another 30,000 megawatts of offshore wind. And I think the first experience in Germany was not very favorable because the technology wasn't quite there. The coordination between transmission and offshore wind generation hasn't worked quite well, but a lot of learning has ironed this out. And I think what really swung Europe to the offshore grid is the amount of competition that they've seen in solicitations that provide the offshore grid interconnection point. Wholesale prices in Europe are higher than in the US, but nevertheless, the bids that they received did not require a premium above market prices. So these did not need to be paid a REC premium or subsidy or anything like that. And before the offshore grid was built and the solicitations were for offshore interconnection point, that hasn't happened. So we've seen a lot more competition with offshore grid and the ability to just interconnect a lot more offshore wind to shore. And as I said, the latest trend is in the UK, where not only is it a planned offshore grid, the UK has also adopted a bidding model where the grid construction itself is bid out, and the UK generator, the UK regulator has documented about 20 to 30% cost savings from just bidding out the transmission solution versus letting incumbents build that transmission. The last point I want to make about offshore grids and the attractiveness that I think sways the developers in Europe to put their weight behind it. A transmission solution might last 40 years, but the offshore wind generation plants might only last 20 years. So you're really not building transmission for just this plant. You're probably building the transmission for this plant and the subsequent plants at those locations. So if you have an offshore grid, it's much easier to deal with repowering. You might have new players come in with new technologies that can interconnect. So the offshore grid is really a platform for offshore generation that shouldn't be linked to individual projects. And the benefits of doing that now are showing up as lower costs as well.
Good point and important consideration. Thank you for that. So I wanted to go back to one of the slides you shared earlier. I believe when Walter, you were talking about the New York narrows and how narrow the bite is. And of course, the map made me realize, New Jersey is so close. And how are they, New York and New Jersey via the PJM ISO, how are they coordinating? And then a follow-up question to that. Who really needs to be at the table? What agencies and entities have a role when it comes to planning an independent transmission approach other than the ISOs?
That's a very good question, Val. PJM, which operates the greater New Jersey and the states south and west of there, and New York are coordinating somewhat. There's a coordination council. They are supposed to do coordinated planning, but it's really not happening very much. Almost all the transmission planning that we see, if it happens at all, is happening at the ISO level. So it's done by New York ISO for New York. It's done by ESSO New England for New England, by PJM for PJM. There's very little planning between the regions, which of course creates a problem. And even the planning, New York has a public policy planning process that works quite well. That might also work really well for offshore wind. PJM and New England don't have that. So one way would be for a separate offshore grid operator to just interconnect to ISO New England or PJM, just like individual generators interconnect. That has its own challenges, like PJM does not allow a transmission interconnection to apply unless there's a generator behind it. But hopefully that will get resolved. And FERC might have to step in to streamline some of that. And our big hope is that the ISOs, who until now have not shown much leadership in this area, are stepping up. New York is already becoming very active, but we're hoping that ISO New England and PJM will also become more proactive in planning a grid that works for offshore wind as well. This is a challenge that needs to be addressed at a federal level, that I think the states need to address. The New England states are already getting together. As many of you may have seen, 5 of the New England governors have signed a letter sent to ISO New England, the grid operator, strongly encouraging them to improve the market design and transmission planning to allow the region to achieve its clean energy goals. NESCO, the New England Organization of State Regulators that interacts with ISO New England, has issued a vision document where the vision also is that regional grid planning would become much more proactive, and that the wholesale power markets would be improved to make clean energy work better for the states and the region. But it's a big problem. FERC, in fact, on Monday will have a technical conference on just that, offshore wind transmission.
Yes.
Yeah, and this is Peter. If I could just add,
go ahead, Peter.
And we're all excited about that. Hannes, it's actually Tuesday, but coming up quick, that FERC conference. But I think Hannes is right that this is a challenge. Since we restructured the Northeast markets, the issue of who does transmission for public policy has been kind of an open question. New York does have that good model. That's a single state RTO, so they don't have some of the coordination issues. But in New England, they do have the Order 1000 process. It hasn't really been used much. Last year, it was used for the first time for a reliability project and really validated some of the benefits of competition by taking prices down, I think, lower than anyone expected. But my main takeaway is I think that the states are the key drivers on this. The RTOs are key. There's certainly a role for the federal government. A lot of this could happen out in the federal waters. But the states can provide directive to their RTOs, as the New England states did through this recent announcement, New York through its public policy process, and also PJM, Maryland, and New Jersey and Maryland and PJM. But I think someone kind of needs to catch this hot potato. And I think the time, since a lot of it's driven by the state goals, would be the states to take control of these processes. Even if the mechanisms are implemented by someone else, I think they can play a key role in pushing this forward.
Great. And let me ask one more question, sort of picking up on your point, Peter. What role is there for the smaller states? I'm thinking Connecticut, or Rhode Island, even Maine. What's their role, and do they have anything to gain from an independent and planned offshore system?
I could take a first cut at that. I'll quick, honestly, leave you some time, but I think that there's the recognition that they're all in it together. So Rhode Island has offshore wind goals. They contracted for 400 megawatts, but they have a broader clean energy goals and are in their own decarbonization process. And Maine has a lot of the onshore resources. So if the transmission is bigger than just offshore wind, I think that could work for them. And also the potential for offshore wind eventually out in the Gulf of Maine. So the resources are there for everyone. And then I think they could benefit from some of the analytical resources and candidly budgets that some of the larger states have. So instead of having to tackle these issues on their own, they can increase essentially their firepower, their throw weight by working with some of the larger states.
Yeah, I think what I would want to add is New England does have a example of joint state procurement. Several years ago, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts jointly procured renewables, and that allows you to procure renewables at a scale that's large enough to maybe trigger more of a planned approach to transmission. That would certainly be very beneficial. Maine is very interesting because we have thousands of low-cost onshore wind in northern Maine. There have been many project proposals that have been made, but none of them could get to market because building transmission from Maine to the rest of New England is too expensive for a single generation project to pay for. A planned approach, if one had built transmission into Maine the way Texas built transmission from East Texas to West Texas, we probably would have thousands of megawatts of onshore wind in Maine being built or having been built by now. So it's a great example where relying on the individual generators to provide for their own transmission solution is often not feasible, while a planned approach would definitely be possible.
Great, thank you for that. Well, I think we have to wrap it up here. We're reaching the top of the hour. I want to thank Walter, Hannes, and Peter for their presentations and the excellent information. Sam, as she mentioned earlier, will be sending around a recording of this webinar in the next day or two, so keep your eyes on your inbox for that. If you need to reach me or have any follow-up questions, my email is up on your screen now, and I'm going to pass it back over to Sam to briefly introduce the next webinar.
Hey, thanks, Val.
Yep.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for attending, and thank you to our guest speakers. As you can see on our screen now, we have a webinar coming up in mid-November that may be of interest to you. The topic is, should a carbon tax be part of the strategy for achieving 100% clean energy? You can read more about that webinar on our website, cesa.org/webinars. And as Val mentioned, we are recording this webinar, and you can find the recording at that web address. We'll also send it to you via email. So thank you again, everyone. We hope to see you at our next webinar. Bye.
Great. Thanks, everyone. And a quick shout out to CESA members that we can continue this conversation via the Zoom link in your calendar invite. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.